Interviews are one of the most commonly used tools in qualitative research. They investigate emotions, opinions, attitudes, views, not so much factual matters, but just the respondents' views on that factual reality, if indeed you even accept that there is an objective factual reality. Some of us may well think that the reality is what we construct it to be. Therefore, people's attitudes, views, and opinions is all that matters. Interviews are essentially meetings in which one party, the researcher, engages in a conversation with another party. That conversation can be more or less closed, more or less directed. It will be more directed in a closed-ended interview and a highly structured interview, and less directed and perhaps allowing for a better rapport to be established between the researcher and the participant in an unstructured or semi-structured type of interview where typically open-ended questions dominate. And the order of the question is ever-changeable, the interview flowing a bit like a real conversation, like a conversation in the real world. Some interviews can be with what we call key informants, key players in a particular field, providing information unknown to others. In that case, the researcher can rely on such privileged sources, companies' directors, for example, or politicians, or any other similar privileged sources. However, very often interviews are with just anyone whose views are worth exploring towards a particular research question. An example of research relying on interviews, amongst other types of qualitative data collection methods, is in my relatively recent paper, Communis and Dudo 2012 in Management Accounting Research. It is about interactive control systems in the public sector. Now, if interviews are essentially conversations between one party and another, that conversation can be more or less directed, more or less structured. So types of interviews vary between structured, semi-structured, completely unstructured, but also narratives and oral histories. If the first three may be self-explanatory in the sense that a structured interview is likely to have fixed questions that repeat for every respondent, perhaps in a particular given way, and this can be useful, for example, in a comparative case study design in which the respondents' answers are to be compared from one case study to another. Semi-structured interviews would consist of loosely formulated, open-ended questions, which may or may not all be answered or indeed prompted to all respondents and in an order that can change from one conversation, one interview to another. These would be the semi-structured interviews. And unstructured would be appropriate, for example, for a very open conversation that could maybe just start from one open question, a large how question or why question, in which the respondent is allowed to pretty much take the discussion in any direction desired. This is highly appropriate in an area that we know very little about. By we, I mean us, the researchers, and indeed the extant literature we base our research on. Now, narratives and oral histories may be less self-explanatory. They basically refer to a type of interview where the respondent is allowed to tell their stories. These stories are likely to be emotional stories or things to do with very personal circumstances, in which case, even if we may be aware of certain issues that would come up and that awareness may be built from the literature, it may be insensitive to interrupt. Therefore, we're just aiming for long quotes and really allowing the respondent to put themselves out there. In that case, the transcript of such an interview is less interrupted by the interviewer and just dominated by the respondent's view, which is normally respected to the extent to which very long quotations of sometimes a page or two are offered in the paper or indeed the thesis resulting from such data. An interesting technique utilized with interviews is that of laddering. If you have a look at this box taken from Baker and Knox and more directly from Easterby Smith, you will notice how the researcher keeps asking questions that are meant to reveal more of what the respondent may be feeling about a particular issue. So in this case, the question is about the design, receiving a relatively short answer. So then another probe is employed to gather more, to find out about the why and about other elements that are perhaps related to shoe design, but not necessarily about the shoe itself, such as tennis. That would be one of those issues that are related to the design of the tennis shoe, but are not particularly about the tennis shoe itself. Ethical considerations with interviews include audio recordings, so making the interviewee aware that the interview would be audio recorded. You do not have to do so, as in you don't have to audio record the interviews, but it is highly, highly recommended because it would allow you to go back to that recording time and time again and reveal perhaps newer and newer facets of what was said, given the fact that this method is a qualitative method coming from an interpretativist, often inductive orientation. It is very likely that you will hear newer things every time you listen to that interview. So it is a fantastic resource. If you could build it, it will be very beneficial. Another ethical consideration is location. This has to do with safety, so the interviews need to take place in a place of safety, and if it is a public place, perhaps one with public liability insurance. Finally, an ethical consideration is the participant identity. This is supposed to be concealed and protected by anonymity, and it is your responsibility as the researcher to establish those boundaries and then protect them at all means. A particular type of interview is the group interview. It works in pretty much the same way as the regular one-to-one interview, but it is between the researcher, so one party, and the interviewees, normally a group of ideally 5, and more often than not anything between 4 and 7, but ideally 5 to 6 is the best size of a focus group. It is a great method for gaining multiple views in one meeting, so a highly efficient method, and the data coming out of focus groups can be recorded by video, audio recording, or simply by note-taking. A combination of methods can really be useful. For example, and most likely or most used, audio recording and note-taking. Often when focus groups are audio recorded, it can be difficult for the transcriber to realize when different people intervene, and therefore it may be useful to corroborate whatever comes from the transcriber with your own written notes at the meeting and be able to correct any inaccuracy in those transcripts. Focus groups are slightly less structured than interviews, perhaps not less structured than unstructured interviews, but since most interviews are semi-structured, think of focus groups as a less structured version of these. Indeed, they work as steered conversations in which the interviewer is a moderator. The moderator should create a situation in which all participants feel comfortable expressing their views. The format of the group interview is of topic guides, so not an interview protocol, not a succession of questions, but more like a succession of themes, really illustrating how this method is a less structured one than that of interviews. There are some problems associated with group interviews, in particular social pressure, condition the responses, but at the same time the benefit of that is that it lowers inhibition, and once somebody expresses perhaps less politically correct or less popular view which is secretly shared by others, then the others are also encouraged to support those views. And this can be a good thing and can counteract the disadvantage of social pressure. Ethical issues associated with focus groups are pretty much the same as those associated with interviews, but apart from that, you would also need to deal with respecting the anonymity of the participant by the other participants. So this is something you need to take into account. The method is particularly useful for market research studies. Perhaps some of you are undertaking those or are likely to undertake those in the future, and was successfully used by Curran and Downing in their 1989 study about the utility of UK government's consultation strategies with small and medium-sized firms.